Continue.
Yes, yes. Hello, I'm Christina Georgiakis, the Director of Educational and Cultural Events at the Hellenic American Women's Council. And I would like to welcome you to our presentation on teaching Greeks to dance, Kalliroi Siganou-Parren, and the Lykeion Ellinidon. It is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce to you an exceptional
and the Lykeion Ellinidon. And the Lykeion Ellinidon.
I don't know, we are hearing something.
Okay, please mute yourselves. Please mute yourselves, people.
Αν και μ' άρεσε η Ζαχάροβα, είχε live τέτοια με από τη Ρωσία.
Please mute yourselves. Let me see who needs to be muted here.
Okay, I will continue.
Yes,
It
please.
is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce to you an exceptional for her age Greek woman, Kalliroi Siganou-Parren. She was a pioneer female journalist, author, women's rights champion, political reformer, philanthropist, and founder of the Lykeion Ellinidon in 1911, 113 years ago. In 1887, she founded the famous Journal of the Ladies, την Εφημερίδα των Κυριών, dedicated to women's issues. She was foremost occupied with women's emancipation through education and work. She famously said, «Το μεγαλείο της πατρίδας έγκυται στο μεγαλείο των θυγατέρων της». In English, the greatness of our motherland rests with the greatness of its daughters. I met our speaker, Claire Aliki Collins, last November during our HAWC conference in Boston. She was preparing for the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Lykeion Ellinidon chapter in Boston in 2023. Claire is an attorney, a proud Hellene, and member of the Boston Lykeion Ellinidon, a volunteer-run nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation and promotion of traditional Greek culture through a rich program of dance performances, classes, workshops, and special events. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you our speaker, Claire Aliki Collins.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Perry, for helping us set everything up here. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to my talk today. As Christina said, my name is Claire Aliki Collins, and I'm a member of the Lykeion Ellinidon here in Boston, Massachusetts. She gave a great description of the Lykeion, so I don't have to tell you what it is. And she gave you a really good introduction to the woman named Kalliroi Siganou-Parren. I personally got to know Parren while I was doing the research for our 25th anniversary event, but even though I was able to get enough information for the event itself, I found that even after the curtain fell, I couldn't stop reading about her because she was just so interesting. So my talk today is going to focus on giving you an understanding of Parren's life and the different tactics she tried to use to fight and promote for the employment and education of Greek women, with a special focus, a little section on her efforts with the Lykeion Ellinidon. I will let everybody know that the talk is scheduled to go for about 40 to 45 minutes, so I won't be able to give you all my research and give a full, exhaustive, and nuanced view of the events surrounding this remarkable woman. However, if afterwards you have questions or comments, I'm more than happy to listen to them. So I'm going to start up a little slideshow. I'll be jumping back and forth between slides, so just bear with me here. I'm going to share the screen. This to slideshow. All right, Christina, can you see the slideshow?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so I've titled this talk, Teaching Greece to Dance, Kalliroi Siganou-Parren and the Lykeion Ellinidon, as a little bit of a play on the double meaning of Lykeion. It is this social club, which is what it is with Kalliroi Siganou-Parren, but it can also be translated as school, famously Aristotle's Lyceum. So what is she doing with the Lykeion? Who is her audience, and what does she want them to take away from the performances of the Lykeion? And how does that tie in to Greek feminism? But in order to understand that, we should talk a little bit about who Kalliroi Siganou-Parren is. She was born in the year approximately 1859. Her family was from an area called Platania Amariou, near the town of Rethymno on Crete. Now, at some point in the late 1860s, Kalliroi and her family have to flee from Crete to Athens because her father had taken part in the uprising, the Cretan uprising of 1866. It's important to remember that Kalliroi was born a Greek. However, she was born in a place that wasn't yet part of the Kingdom of Greece and was under occupation, and that she came to Greece at a very young age, but as a refugee. In her own writings, Parren doesn't really dwell on her childhood memories, but one thing does shine through. She praises her father for putting her family's meager resources towards her education. It's impossible to overstate the role that education played in young Kalliroi's life. As I said, her father did give everything they could towards her education, but quite frankly, it wasn't that much. Since the Revolution of 1821, public education existed for both girls and boys, but only at a primary school level for girls. Both girls and boys would learn to read and write, but the boys' schools also had science, history, mathematics, and the girls' schools had sewing and light handicrafts. If a girl could not afford a private school, then she would not get any higher level of education than basic reading and writing. Even physical education was considered to be inappropriate for girls because it could possibly damage her ability to bear children. But Parren's father was having none of that. When she was young, she attended a French primary school in Paris, and when she was older, she attended the Lykeion school. Now, the Lykeion school, come on. Apologize, something is happening with there it is. There's the Lykeion school. The Lykeion school is a private, it still exists, by the way. It's a private all-girls school in the center of Athens. It was founded for two reasons. First, there were groups of people who did want to educate their daughters. But second, they wanted to do so in a way in accordance with the tenets of the Greek Orthodox faith. Other private schools at the time were run by Protestant missionaries, and the Greeks wanted something that was their own. When she studied at the Lykeion, Parren was able to be part of a community of like-minded, educated young girls, and all of them going for the same degree, the highest degree a Greek girl could obtain in the 1870s, and that is the teaching certificate. The Lykeion is important as not just as a fact that it was her kind of genesis as an academic, but because of the community that she built there. Parren, through her life, one of her greatest strengths, and you'll see this over and over again, is her ability to build networks of people, usually women, that she can then call together for collective action. And when you go through her life and you look at these networks, her nearest and dearest are always graduates from the Lykeion school, even if they graduated 10, 30, 40 years after her. This school was a tight-knit community, and probably to this day exists as a way to be a woman's network within the heart of Greece. However, going back to Parren, in 1878, she graduates from the Lykeion school, and she has a job offer. She's going to run a Greek school for girls in Odessa, Ukraine, the great port city by the Black Sea. Now, at this time period, Odessa is a multi-ethnic, multilingual city filled with Ukrainians, Russian, Jews, Armenians, and Greeks, amongst others. The Greeks of Odessa wanted Parren to come there because they were concerned about their children losing their connection to the Greek language. They were anxious to ensure that their children were able to speak, read, write in Greek, and they wanted their daughters to have the advantages of a formal education, the same level as what a girl in Athens might get. Parren taught the girls in Odessa for 2 years, and then left to take another teaching position. This position, apologies. This position was as the director of the Zepeo-Kentrikon Parthenogogion School in Adrianouplis, which is modern-day Edirne in Turkey. Now, Adrianoupoli is another multi-ethnic and multilingual city. However, when she took her position, it was still reeling from the effects of the Russo-Turkish War. And she would have been living in an area that had gone through some pretty serious atrocities, both against Muslims and against Christians. So here, the community's anxiety about ensuring that their children spoke Greek wasn't just about trying to make sure that a language was passed down. It was about trying to make sure that an identity wasn't wiped out. And in fact, a lot of the girls who went and taught in these regions, places in Thrace, Macedonia, were frequently, apologies, were frequently part of a group, a community that had a severe fear of assimilation. The church actually advocated for girls from that region to go to the HAWC to be trained as teachers so they could return and teach in their hometowns. At the time that Parren was there, however, she doesn't seem to encounter any of the difficulties that some of her later compatriots faced during the Balkan Wars. Instead, her time in Odessa and in Adrianoupoli was an emancipation. This word is very important to Parren. So what does it mean? Her degree, her education gave her the ability to travel outside of Greece, live and work with communities in the Greek diaspora, earn her own money, and run her own schools, all before the age of 20. These years would have left Parren with an indelible impression about the importance of education for young women, women like herself and the students that she had. It was during this time that she also got something else that I hear is rather important, a husband. In 1880, Kalliroi marries a man named Jean Parren, an Anglo-French journalist who was stationed at a news bureau in Constantinople. When they marry, the couple moves to Athens and take up residence on Panepistimios Street. Jean Parren continues to work as a journalist and becomes the director of the Athenian news agency. Parren, however, can't continue with her job. Married women, especially wealthy ones, were not expected to work or even spend much time in the public sphere. That was the dominion of men. In fact, a married woman was not allowed to work for pay unless her husband gave permission, and any wages she earned would have been his. Instead, women were expected to be what they called the angels of the house, to run the private domestic sphere. Parren and her husband, however, did not hold to this belief. So although Parren stopped formally teaching, she was still involved in intellectual and literary life. The 1880s and 90s in Athens was characterized by an outpouring of art, writing, scholarship, architecture, and philanthropy, along with massive changes in politics and business that changed the landscape of the city and built connections between Greece and the rest of the world. In the streets and cafes of Athens, the men would discuss the politics of the day, the struggles to reform and modernize Greece, and the efforts of the Kingdom of Greece to expand their boundaries to rescue the Greeks in regions like Macedonia, Epirus, Thrace, Crete, Micracia, and other places under foreign rule. Parren wanted to be part of this conversation, but she couldn't just go into a cafeteria or into a street to do this. It would not have been proper, as she would have been a woman. In addition, it might seem strange to us, but women were excluded from the public sphere. They were not allowed to be in public for royal marriages, political speeches, and in 1896, they were not allowed to be spectators at the Olympic Games. So Parren had to bring these conversations to her. After her marriage, Parren began to host regular salons at her home on Saturdays for the writers, artists, and great thinkers of the time. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with salons, but they're typically held in private homes with a restricted guest list. Salonnaires, the women who ran them, organized the events to engender conversation, debate, and the sharing of artistic works such as music, literature, and poetry. In Athens, then, this type of space is a space where a woman can go and interact with as many people as she wanted without formally going into public. I would like to highlight a couple important, apologies. I would like to highlight a couple important men who were frequently at who were frequently at Parren's salons. Gregoris Xenopoulos, who was a famous writer, apologies, and Kostis Palamas, who was a poet. These two men were got to know Parren through her salons and became some of her biggest advocates throughout her life. In addition to men such as this, she would have met journalists and other educated women, many of whom were probably educated in schools much like Parren was. Now, I've talked a little bit about this idea of a network, that the Lykeion school was kind of Parren's first network. These salons are sort of the next level of that. Her greatest supporters are still going to be the Lykeion schools, but now she's beginning to make friends with men who are journalists, who are writers, who are thinkers, and critically, who have contacts outside of Greece. So this will give her the opportunity to take part in an intellectual life, not just as a listener, but as an active participant. She began to collaborate and work as a journalist and publishing in local periodicals. It was in this area that she probably would have encountered what we call the women question. Now, the woman question is the debate over the equal status between women and men. In Greece, this debate had been going since about 1860s, but in the 1880s, the argument intensified. As a little bit of background, I should again remind us that Parren was born into a country that was new, but had a very old culture and a level of gender-based disenfranchisement that most of us would find very, very difficult to understand. Putting aside the beliefs of individual men, such as, Parren's father and her husband, in the eyes of the state, the unfortunate truth is that women were fundamentally less than men. They had no representation in government. They could not vote. They could not own property. If they worked, their wages, which would be 20 to 30% less than a man's, belonged to their husbands. If they married, more likely than not, it was arranged by their fathers. If they did not marry, they were social pariahs. And if they had children, they had no legal rights to their custody. One of the most insidious aspects of Greek society at the time that contributed to this disenfranchisement was the concept of the dowry, which essentially a young woman's eligibility for marriage was determined in part by a payment that could be made from the bride's family to the groom's family. This payment was a serious burden, especially on the less wealthy, and contributed to a preference for male children who could inherit the property and continue the line, as opposed to a female child who was considered to just be a burden. There's evidence in some of the demographic and historical records that this led in some places to a practice of female infanticide, either deliberately or through what is known as mortal neglect, where you essentially do not care for an infant until it perishes. Parren would have been aware of this. She, in fact, wrote about it later on in her life and specifically identified the dowry as one of the most insidious things that oppressed women in Greece. Now, the irony is that for anyone who thinks that a woman was a burden, even the most cursory glance into the history books shows you how wrong these beliefs were. In Greece, women worked all the time, whether they were urban or rural. They were mothers and homemakers, but they also kept house, lugged water, wove cloth, cared for children, and worked either in the fields, in factories, in household industries, and trade organizations. They taught schools, they translated novels, they ran businesses. One cannot help us wonder if the sort of anxiety in the 1880s was due in part to the fact that women were rising, that no matter what the society said was appropriate, they just could not stop the new women of this new country from seeking out the equilibrium that they felt they deserved. Now, some of the male attendees in Parren's salons were in favor of this. Palamas especially, he saw women as a peaceful, moralizing force that could help create a more civilized world. In a letter to Parren, Palamas told her that he believed that the emancipation and enlightenment of women, by which he means their education, would make them better mothers and housewives. The opposing side, however, insisted that granting any equality to women would essentially decrease man's share in the world and cause the sexes to enter into some unnatural manly state. They accused these women who asked for their rights as being feminists. Now, for them, feminists was a foreign Western idea that had no business interacting with the natural Christian Hellenic order of the world. The man on the screen is a man named Emmanuel Roivis, and he has some not very nice things to say about women. I'm not going to translate what's on the screen there. If you can read it, this is the sort of nonsense that he likes to say. Another man who wrote anonymously advocated for men to beat their wives if they ever spoke about asking for equal rights. Now, as we have already discussed, Parren was very educated, and she would have understood what feminism was and how it was. Yes, it was a Western idea, but it was existing all throughout Europe. In her writings, Parren expresses great affection for many Western feminists, including Susan B. Anthony. However, she knew that if she branded herself as a feminist, she would never get any traction in Greece. So she had to promote her views by packaging them in a more palatable way. She avoids the term feminist and instead chooses the term emancipation. That's when she starts deciding to fight for the rights of women through emancipation. What she means by emancipation is a woman who is able to be self-sufficient, educated, and ultimately find a good marriage based on trust and friendship. Parren knew that the alleged flaws of women that people pointed to justify their subordination was not natural. It was not the law of God or the law of biology. It was modern men with modern ideas, including politicians, who went out of their way to prevent women from advancing. Parren was entirely in line with her times. She did believe that there were two spheres, that there was a female sphere and that there was a male sphere, and that women had essential traits that suited them to the female sphere, and men had essential traits that suited them to the male sphere. Where she made the radical step was potentially by saying that those spheres were equal and contributed equally to society, and thus needed to be granted equal opportunities. She recognized that one action she could take to further the cause of women's equality would be to find a way to speak directly to the women of Athens and, in fact, the rest of Greece without male influence. What she needed was a medium where women could express themselves in their own words and develop their own voices as writers. So she decided to publish a newspaper. In 1887, Parren published the first edition of her newspaper, the Feminist, the Women's Journal. To his credit, her husband Jean not only did not prevent his wife from doing this, but supported her efforts. They actually set up the offices of the Feminist together, and the first issue went to print on March 8th, 1887. It sold out 3,000 copies within a single day. The Feminist was revolutionary for its time. It was a woman's newspaper written by women, for women, and the topics covered a range of articles specifically selected to appeal to women. This included current events, domestic and foreign politics, depictions of important political figures, fine arts, popular arts, religion, and advice for housewives, mothers, and educators. Importantly, there was also reports on activities of women from other countries and international efforts to advance women's rights. It also included Greek women's own writing. Their own people who were subscribers could send in their own writing, whether it was fiction, nonfiction, or poetry, and see their own voices reflected back in this newspaper. At its height, the paper had a circulation in the tens of thousands and a network of subscribers in Greece and in the Greek diaspora. Back to that word network. This distribution demonstrated that Parren understood something new, the rising power of mass communication in an increasingly urbanized industrial world. The end of the 19th century is marked by a revolution in communication technologies, primarily the increase in the number of telegraph lines and cheaper production materials, along with rising literacy rates and a market for new material. She recognized that the newspaper was the most immediate way to disseminate her ideas along with other women's thoughts, poetry, and investigations. And by doing so, create a networked community of women throughout the world who were united by two things: their gender and their ethnicity, Greek. This is what is sometimes referred to as an imagined community, not an imaginary community. An imagined community is a community rooted in very real, everyday things, but it's formed through an act of an imagination. It's not your neighbor that you can walk out the street and shake their hand. You're united by an idea. And here the idea they were united by is that their Greekness and their femaleness were linked, and that this afforded them certain rights. Parren used her networks from her school days, her time as a teacher, her connections within the literary elite, and she built a distribution system for a paper that would last for 30 years. In addition, she traveled and visited other feminists and feminist organizations throughout Europe and even the United States. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about what Parren specifically used her paper for. I can't go into detail about everything, so I'm just going to touch a few important points. First and foremost, let me see if I can show you guys this. It's not, okay, it's not showing it. All right. So she did contribute multiple articles to her paper, and then sometimes she did so using a pseudonym, either because she wanted to hide her identity as the editor of the paper, or because she was concerned about people knowing that she was the person who was writing certain things. One of the things that she did was write articles that touched on social issues that were really important to her. And first and foremost of this was women's entering the university. All right, so in September of 1887, she publishes an article called "Why She Was Not Accepted to the University," about the true reason a girl who had graduated from the Lykeion school was excluded from attending university. In this article, she refutes the sort of standard statement that the high school wasn't rigorous enough to prepare the woman for higher learning, but rather revealed that the university professors had actually agreed that she had passed all of her exams and completed all the relevant tutoring, but it was in fact a minister in the Department of Education who had stopped the young girl from enrolling in the university. She touched on other issues that were also important to her. I've raised the issue of female infanticide and the dowry. She also advocated for physical education for young girls. And she particularly wanted to introduce Greek women to the idea of there being a Greek woman's history. Now, in our day and age, we're very comfortable with the concept of women's history. You can take classes on women's history in college. You can go to a store and buy a book detailing the childhood of famous, American women or Greek women. This is not uncommon. In Parren's age, history was written by men, for men, and about men. So Parren spent much of her time and much of her efforts in almost every issue of her newspaper, highlighting a specific historical or literary Greek woman in order to bring out this idea that there was a forgotten Greek history of women. She used famous historical figures such as the heroines of the Revolution of 1821, intellectual figures, including writers, teachers, philosophers, historical figures such as queens, religious leaders, martyrs, and even warriors. One central figure that she returned to time and time again was Aspasia, a massive intellectual talent from 5th century Athens. However, she's best known to history as Pericles' mistress. This is sidelining an incredibly important woman. Not only was she a highly educated philosopher who counted amongst her students Socrates, she also opened a school in Athens during the 5th century for the education of young girls. For Parren, I think it's easy for us to see why she might identify with such a woman and feel perhaps hurt that for millennia now, her countrymen have sidelined this incredible personage and almost erased her position from history. Time and again, she does this. She takes a historical figure that perhaps has been forgotten or misunderstood and reframes them. What she is doing is she's creating the first women's Greek history. Quite frankly, I do think that this is remarkable. This is an argument that is made not politically, but historically. It's saying women have been Greek. We've been Greek for a very long time. And at each and every moment, Women have contributed on every level to society. She's saying that it is not, in fact, a traditional Greek value that women should be subjugated, but rather it is a modern construction, something that has been imposed on us. So we have to remember our past, remember where we came from, and this will show us where we're going. Talked a little too much about this because I'm very excited about it, but I do want to mention that she also used the Feminist on Kalliroi to publish her own writing, including novels, her own fiction writing, including novels. She wrote 3 novels serially in the Feminist on Kalliroi that collectively are known as the Books of the Dawn. And these are really remarkable novels because they center around 2 different heroines, both of whom are working women, one who's a painter and one who's a journalist. And it talks about their efforts to live by their own principles, to engage in marriages that they find satisfying, and to raise children in the way that they feel is correct. Other authors did deal with similar types of characters at this time, but in every case except Parren, the heroine is punished for stepping outside what is perceived as the correct role. In Parren's work, the women are not punished, but in fact rewarded. They find, healthy marriages based on equality and friendship, and stable, loving families. I just want to read just in translation, a quote from the first of these novels in which she is describing her heroine, the emancipated woman. She was no longer the calm maid, sweet in nature with a somehow absent-minded expression. She was the rebel woman, the one who would not cede to others the right to define her future and life according to social requirements and traditions and superstitions that had become laws. The rebel woman. These are strong words. Now, although some of the male contemporaries of Parren supported her, such as Palamas, others saw her and the women who worked for her as dangerous. If she described women as being strong, they felt that this meant that she believed that men were weak. They used disgusting and insulting language when they described women who published in the Feminist on Kalliroi, because they believed in their minds that by daring to write in a newspaper, these women had surrendered the protection of polite society and did not deserve to be treated with respect. Parren did not let these critiques or backward thinking stop her. In fact, they probably spurred her on. In 1893, Manuel Ruizis attacked her and called her newspaper laughable and labeled her an embarrassment. She wrote back laughing at him, dismantled his arguments, and then called him a guardian angel of the past. So Parren has been using the Feminist on Kalliroi to promote women's writing, women's history, and advocate sort of for women to have their own voices. But she's also using it to advocate for the women who might not even be part of the network of the Feminist on Kalliroi, the women who might be too poor, too rural, or simply just too illiterate to have it. Parren knew that she was privileged. She spoke 5 languages, she moved in an elite circle, and she had access to halls of power in Athens. She had the ability and the means to travel extensively and attend conferences on women's rights in other countries, and she had a husband who saw her as an equal. She knew that she had a unique opportunity. So she took the privilege that she had and she turned it into service. She took the tools available to her, specifically her newspaper, the networks, and her social status, and she began to use them to try and create concrete change for her female compatriots. One example of this is on October 23rd, 1888, Parren uses her network in the Feminist on Kalliroi to collect 2,500 signatures of women protesting the exclusion of women from various types of legislation covering education, vocational training, and employment. Their argument was that as mothers and wives, they played a role in society and deserved to receive the same benefits as everyone else who played a role. Again, we're back to this language about motherhood and, and marriage. Parren knew that she had to adapt her efforts to the social structures and understandings that dominated Greek thought. So she's not going to use the language of equality. Instead, she's going to call upon the image of the mother. She uses the metaphor of a Greek mother as being the mother of a nation. And just as a household without a mother can't flourish, a nation without strong mothers can't flourish. She connects this with the Spartans of old. She says that a strong mother, both in family and in the nation, was necessary and indispensable to raising strong sons who would become fierce soldiers and citizens devoted to their nation. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a few things. I do want to make one point that it's also through the Feminist on Kalliroi that she's ultimately able to get the support necessary to force the University of Athens to open its doors to women. Essentially by placing as much political pressure on legislatures as she possibly has, she is able to get a woman named Ioanna Stephanopoli entered into the Department of Philology in 1890. In 1892, the next two women were entered, sisters Angeliki and Alexandra Papagiotatu, and they entered the Department of Medicine. Women in this university did have a really hard time. They would enter their room and their allegedly educated and modern young progressive male classmates would stand up and yell, "Sto kuzina, back to the kitchen, back to the kitchen." But once the rocks started falling, the avalanche couldn't be stopped. More and more women started attending university. Many of these women had graduated from schools like the Lykeion. And as women began to go not just and achieve academically, but also professionally, Parren kept a record of all these women. She published their achievements in her newspaper. If they opened a pharmacy, if they attained a teaching position, if they gave a lecture, she would report it in the newspaper so people would know about what was going on. She was also concerned with the education of lower class women. She did believe it was important for everyone to learn how to read and write. So in 1890, she founds a series of free schools for poor women called Sunday schools, where women could learn basic reading and writing and other skills that could make them money. Her advocacy on behalf of poor women combines education and employment opportunities along with labor protection. She devotes time in the Feminist on Kalliroi to writing articles advocating for strong social protection for women workers, including limiting working hours, ensuring stable wage rates, and even maternity leave. She also fought against the dowry system because she knew it made young women without means exceptionally vulnerable. In the 1890s, she starts founding other organizations dedicated to promoting women's employment and education. And by 1900, she appealed to the Prime Minister Theodoros Deligiannis, and she wins some of these state protections for women and children workers, including increased wages and limits on working hours. These first efforts actually laid the groundwork for legislation passed over a decade later during the Venizelos administration. So because she went out and did the hard work then, 10 years later, the legislators finally caught up with her. So let's talk about the vote. One of the thorniest issues about Parren is what exactly was her approach to women's right to vote. Part of the problem is that different reputable sources have divergent accounts about what Parren did or did not do. Some people will say that she went personally and fought for the vote with the prime ministers. Others will say that she was entirely opposed to it. First and foremost, I think we have to remember that the question of women's suffrage in Greece before World War I is basically entirely theoretical. It's more common to be brought up by a misogynist, the idea of women voting, than by someone who might want equal rights for women, because the misogynist will use the specter of a voting woman to scare any moderates and say, well, this person is nuts. They want women to vote. On the surface, Parren makes a lot of statements that says that she does not support women voting. For example, in 1888, she wrote that the emancipated woman, this is her heroine, did not demand political rights, meaning voting, but rather demanded education and employment. In 1910, Parren would write an article that essentially says, "Why I do not ask for the vote." But her position may not have been one that was her belief that women shouldn't vote, but rather one of tactics. She may have believed that Greek women needed a higher rate of literacy and more social and economic independence before the vote could even mean anything with them. She also knew that if she openly spoke about women voting, she might not get the support from more moderate progressives like Palamas that she was currently enjoying. At the moment, men found her to be reasonable and moderate and did not see her as a threat. Her true feelings to the vote, I think, are very ambiguous. So she does state that she does not think the vote is necessary. However, there are hints in her writing that she actually regrets not having the vote. And I'm just going to point out one of them here. In 1902, the women of Finland achieved suffrage. And as she's writing in her paper, she reports on this. When she reports on the women of Finland achieving suffrage, she praises their efforts and calls them happy. And then she turns the focus onto Greece, and she bemoans her own countrywomen's status without the vote and refers to her and all of her countrywomen as slaves. So this is going to bring us to about the year 1897. This is a really important turning point for Parren for many of the same reasons that it was a turning point for the rest of Greece. In 1897, the Greco-Turkish War, sometimes called the Unfortunate War, was a disaster for Greece. After the defeat, Greece lost territory, particularly in the north, and was forced to pay reparations to the Ottoman Empire, which, although they were small, was still a burden on the young nation and caused major political upheaval. The truth is that a big reason that the Greek army was simply that their army was smaller, their weapons weren't as good, and they did not have the support of their supposed allies. Nevertheless, there was a feeling in Greece that the defeat was due in part to the lack of a strong, unified Greek identity. Parren used an organization that she had founded in 1896, the Union of Greek Women, as a way to promote women as the key to creating a strong and unified nation. What Parren did was essentially take her ideals of the emancipated woman who is in a different sphere but equal to man, and tie it into the ideals of Greek nationalism. She says that if a woman was the mother of the nation, then in order to have the strong nation, the woman needed to be able to participate fully in the public life. Frustrated by this perceived lack of true leadership in the government, Parren and the Union of Greek Women dedicated their efforts and their funds to alleviating the effects of war on Greece. These women, many of whom were upper and middle class women, organized a full-scale assault in almost every aspect of the war. They ran fundraising efforts, particularly to care for refugees from places where the fighting was the fiercest, such as Crete. They developed hospital programs and trained women as nurses, which was a primarily male occupation at the time. They created mobile medical operating units to reach the front lines and provided medical care and first aid in the field. They worked with government officials to coordinate the war effort. They even sewed uniforms for the soldiers and had them shipped to the front. In this display of skill, Parren's ideals are on full view. Here are a group of women who are using their feminine skills, organization, management, logistics, and caregiving to advance the Greek cause. Through necessity, these women were able to enter roles that had been previously considered exclusively the domain of man. However, once they were in those roles, there was no going back. After 1897, then, there's a decided shift in Parren's rhetoric. Much of her rhetoric about a woman's position in Greece at this point really does lean very heavily into the nationalistic tone. It's not just about women being equal to men and women being mothers. It is specifically women being necessary to create a strong Hellenic identity, which is the only thing that will create a strong Greek nation. Now, like many Greeks, Parren was concerned about this lack of a singular unified Hellenic identity, particularly as there were so many Greeks who did not live within the boundaries of the current kingdom of Greece. For Parren, then, the Greek women as mothers were the first educators of their children and needed to be able to teach their children the language, the history, and the traditions. She explained that Greek women were the mothers of the nation and just like they were mothers of the household, and if they weren't doing their job, then that was why they were raising weak sons. So in the 1900s, then, Parren is establishing herself as a moderate feminist In 1910, she does start using the term feminist. That's the earliest time that I can see her use that to apply to herself. She is running multiple social organizations, including ones that tend to the needs of refugees. She is organizing with international women's rights committees, and she is publishing a weekly paper. I'm just tired thinking about that. But she decided that she was going to do something else. She determined that Greece needed something that would unite two fundamental beliefs. First, that women needed to be full and respected members of the Greek nation. And second, that Greeks needed to have a connection to their full history in order to have a strong Greek identity. These two came together in one long-lasting organization, the Lykeion Ellinidon. The Lykeion Ellinidon was created on December 2nd, 1910, where a group of 7 women met on Panepistimios Street. On February 19th, 1911, the charter of this new organization was formally approved by the Greek government. Now, it is important to note that it was not lower class women who were part of the Lykeion initially. It was upper and middle class women, educated women, many of whom would have graduated either from the university or from the Lykeion, who had the time and financial support to devote themselves to social advancement and cultural work. The organization's goals, then, were not about advocacy, and they were not about distributing resources to portions of the population that needed them. Much like Parren used her newspaper to create this idea of a Greek woman's history that needed to be brought back, she uses the Lykeion as a staging area to create Greek history. Parren's goal is to explore the traditional cultural artifacts, particularly dance, of Greece, and create a long-lasting tradition, linking the modern traditional dances all the way back to the ancient world. Sorry. This focus on traditional culture, while linking it with women's causes, does seem to contain within it a paradox. Traditional and conservative individuals were not in favor of women's advancement and certainly wouldn't have been very happy with a woman taking center stage and describing to Greece her own history. On the other hand, Parren was done with a lot of the sort of Western-focused feminist organizations because she felt that, much like Greece's allies had sometimes looked over Greece, that the Greek women had been looked over by the women of England, France, and America, and that their own personal understanding of what it would mean to be a Greek feminist was not taken into account. Parren basically said, women are the leaders of their households and the guardians of Greek ethnic and national identity. So she created the Lykeion as a way for the educated women of Greece to shape conversations about Greece's place in the world by educating Greeks, inspiring them, and reminding them of their own honorable and long history. From the very beginning, these activities were multifaceted, but the centerpiece of them was the dance. Parren used her time and her resources to create a dance program that she believed illustrated the continued tradition of Greek dance from the ancient Greek polis to the modern Greek state. She worked with choreographers and traditional dance folklorists to create ancient Greek dances, sort of extrapolating backwards, and complete with costumes of archaic dress. But she also wanted to preserve the current dances that she had seen in the Greek villages, which she believed were the descendants of this classical tradition. She studied the similarities between the ancient dances and the modern dances, and identifying formations of the dances, specific movements, even dance names, in order to create this link. So what do you do once you have these dances? Well, as part of a dance troupe, I can tell you that the first thing you do is that you have a performance. Although the Lykeion had performed privately and had conducted private lessons, the first performance of the Lykeion was on May 1st, 1911. and they called it the Anthesterion. This took place at the neoclassical Megaron, Zapeon Megaron, and it was named after the ancient Dionysian spring festival of the flowers. Surrounded by columns and garlands, the Lykeion women performed choreographed ancient routines alongside traditional dances like a sirtos, a balos, a kalamatiano, and even a pentozali. Combining the ancient and the modern, the dancers wore reconstructions of ancient Greek garb and traditional attire from the region of Megara. It was considered to be a triumph for the organization. Having come out in public and danced, they did this over and over and over again. In 1912, they had another festival with performances at the Municipal Theater in Piraeus. Apologies. They had a reception and performance at the Acteon Hotel in Neofalero with tea and Greek dances for a delegation of women from the International Council of Women. And in 1914, the Lykeion performed at the Agleion, the neoclassical summer palace in Kerkyra, in honor of Kaiser Wilhelm II and his sister, Queen Sophia of Greece. However, Parren always intended that the main audience for the Lykeion were the Greeks themselves. The early performances were part of an emerging national narrative about Greek identity. Parren's ideas about a continuous dance tradition going from the ancient to the modern aligned perfectly with the government's approach to understanding a Hellenic identity that had existed in Greece since the Bronze Age. In the dances and festivals, the Lykeion was able to create a visual representation of the country's long history and continued cultural identity. Hellenism, traveling all the way back to the Bronze Age, all of a sudden appeared in front of the very eyes of modern Athenians. The best example of this is what happened in 1914, which was called the Stadium Series. In 1914, the Lykeion organized a massive event in the Panathenaic Stadium. Now, I personally think that Parren chose the Panathenaic Stadium in part because 20 years earlier, they didn't let women attend the Olympic Games there. So this was a little bit of her taking a dig at the government. But whatever reason, it was the perfect location to showcase her new program, which was functionally a monumental procession. Women from the Lykeion and from regions all around Greece wore ancient and traditional attire and came into the Panathenaic Stadium as if they were coming down through history, carrying with them symbols of Hellenism. After it was over, they all came together and participated in dances that were both ancient and modern. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, that sounds kind of familiar, this is effectively what happened during the opening ceremony of the Athens 2004 Olympics. This idea of presenting Greek history through a monumental procession showing a diachronic Hellenism with an emphasis on art, music, and dance, I think Parren is the one who developed this. It's utilized by the Greek government time and time again throughout the 20th century as a way to enforce either political propaganda, cultural identity, or even just pride in one's country. But Parren is the one who came up with the idea of actually demonstrating the line of women going from the past into the future and giving us history in that way. I think it's also important to point out that the choices of what dances were danced was probably also rooted in politics. At almost every performance since its beginning, the Lykeion performed dances from Crete. Remember all the way back to the beginning? Parren is from Crete. She was born and had to escape due to a Cretan uprising and came to Athens as a refugee. When the Lykeion started performing, Crete was not yet part of the nation of Greece. It had yet to gain its independence or autonomous and then come into Greece, which I believe happened in 1912. Similarly, other dances that were very popular were dances from Epirus, Macedonia, and Thrace, very contested regions in the northern part of Greece. By including dances from these regions that weren't part of the Kingdom of Greece, but still had a strong Greek cultural identity, Parren is making a political statement saying these dances are part of a Greek tradition and they are part of our shared heritage. If you were an average Athenian Yorgos hanging out at the Panathenaic Stadium in 1914, you would have been treated to a sight something that you had never seen before. You would have seen dances from all over the country performed in the same place as part of the same narrative. Just like Parren used her newspaper to create the idea of a woman's history for Greeks, here she is using dance and monumental spectacle to create a narrative of Greek history for anyone who can come. I could talk about the Lykeion forever, so I'm going to move on. I want to give us a chance to talk about sort of the back half of Parren's efforts. The Lykeion Ellinidon flourished before World War I, and Parren continued to publish her Feministon Kyrion. However, Greece enters World War I in 1917 on the side of the British and the French. And the way that this happens is incredibly traumatic for the country. Referred to the Noemvriana, there is a split government with the king in Athens and Prime Minister Venizelos in Thessaloniki. Venizelos comes in and takes control of Athens. This is the Noemvriana, and Greece enters the war on the side of the British. After this happens, in 1917, Parren is sent into political exile because she supported the monarchy. When I first read this, I found this to be almost disconcerting, because most of Parren's political ideals were very much in line with the Venizelos administration. Labor protection laws, more relaxed roles for women, and the idea of how, Greek identity can be developed. They even shared a home island. So why would Parren go with a more conservative monarchy rather than the administration that promoted the ideals that she supposedly fought for? This is where my own bias as a modern person has come in. Because what I forgot was that although the Venizelos administration may have been liberal, it was composed entirely of men. The monarchy, on the other hand, had women in it. And not just any women, but women such as Queen Olga and Queen Sophia, who took active roles in exactly the sort of activities that Parren herself advocated for. Queen Olga founded the Emagalismos Hospital. She participated and helped Parren with many of her own charitable efforts. And when Parren was conducting research into the traditional attire of Greek villages, Olga sent Parren her own collection of Greek dolls that had been sent to her when she came to the country as a young Russian princess. There was perhaps a personal friendship or just a professional admiration between the two women. And it may have been that Parren was more likely to look upon the monarchy with women in it who seemed to have the same values as her as more of a type of representative government than a democratically elected parliament that did not seem to care about her advocating for her own personal rights. Parren published article after article in the Feministon Kyrion praising the monarchy's neutral status in World War I and warning against entering the war. So when Venizelos took power, she was the first and only woman sent into political exile during World War I. I find this very interesting for a person who claims to not seek political power, which is the domain of men. She somehow did enough to reap the not the rewards, but the demerits of doing that. When Parren returns in 1918 or 1919. I'm not sure exactly when she comes back. She does find a bit of a different world. After World War I, many of the groups that she was part of, including her own newspaper, had been shut down. The Lykeion itself had actually been shut down, with the exception of the dance troupe. When Parren comes back, she's kind of finds herself in a place without a sound footing. Many of the old networks that she used no longer are functioning. People have either, not wanted to be associated with her as a political exile, or perhaps they've moved on to different things, or quite simply died. Nevertheless, this did not prevent her from attempting to take part in political and social action. Personally, for her in the 1920s, most of her political action is once again working on an international level with various international organizations. She takes part in what's called the Little Entente of Women, an organization of women's groups from Balkan countries, which are collaborating together to elevate the status of women. What's particularly interesting about this group is that many of the countries in this entente, like Romania and Bulgaria, are also struggling with what Parren and her contemporaries struggled with, which is that many of the tenets of Western feminism don't work for them. So they tried to create an organization where women within the Little Entente of women, Balkan women, can speak together and try and share information about the efforts they're making to attain emancipation or suffrage in this case. However, she's not as active in this time period as she is prior to her exile. And I do think that part of it might come back down to the vote. In Greece at the time, the majority of the feminist organization were laser focused on the vote, and Parren just could not seem to shake off her old reluctance. Even though she does focus on international work, she's not the leader as she has been in previous years. I did find one letter that was written to her by the Prime Minister in 1930, Papanastasiou, asking her to reach out to all of her contacts to attend a conference for peace in the Balkans. He sent personal invitations to her, asking for her support and for the Lykeion members' support, not necessarily as delegates, but as organizers, to try and reach out and find people other women who would be interested in participating, and encourage them to participate as well. So we can see at this time, her political cachet is pretty low, and she's not operating on the same level as she had prior to her exile. The Lykeion, on the other hand, is growing. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the Lykeion is growing, blossoming, and changing. The dance troupe of the Lykeion, which had continued to dance when Parren was in exile, kind of refined its mission under a new dance director, Angeliki Hatzimitchalis, developing more of a focus on collecting and presenting regional dances and attire while maintaining the ancient or archaic dance performance traditions. This organization, the Lykeion Ellinidon, then became known in Greece and outside of Greece as primarily a dance organization. The Lykeion did have other events. They organized lectures, they set up fairs for traditional Greek handicrafts, they promoted artists, women artists, both who were painters and sculptors, and also who worked with traditional work like weaving, pottery, and beadwork. And in a rather interesting turn of events, the Lykeion Ellinidon actually performed in Delphi. Let's see if I have a picture of that here. Nope. Come on. Okay. The Lykeion Ellinidon performed in Delphi under the direction of a woman named Eva Palmer Sikelianos in a production of Prometheus Bound. Eva Palmer Sikelianos was a dancer and artist who wanted to find the most authentic way to present a Greek play. So she selected to do it in Delphi with garments that she wove herself, with music that she instructed people to compose to be as close to ancient music as possible, and with a choreographed performance that she worked closely with the Lykeion Ellinidon on, and many of the performers themselves were young women from the Lykeion Ellinidon, precisely because they had spent so many years studying ancient dance. The centerpiece of the Lykeion's efforts, however, was what's called the Stadium Series. Just like in 1914, beginning in 1925, the Lykeion continues to mount these spectacular, monumental performances inside the Panathenaic Stadium, bringing together history, art, music, dance, traditional costumes, traditional culture for audiences from all around Greece, highlighting this idea of a unified Greek identity. Unfortunately, after the August 4th revolution and the establishment, August 8th revolution and the establishment of the Metaxas dictatorship, these types of performances began to get a more nationalistic, fascist tone. This is not uncommon under fascist dictatorships. Performances, art, science, newspapers, even sports end up becoming appropriated as part of the state propaganda machine. Metaxas's dictatorship doesn't look like other fascist dictatorships at the same time. However, one thing they do have in common is this idea of a glorified past. And for Metaxas, who shut down almost all other women's groups, he allows the Lykeion to stay open because he can use the Lykeion as part of the spectacle that promotes this idea of a glorious Greek past. It's not just the Lykeion. Whenever Metaxas goes and has videos made of him, whenever there are pictures, events, he somehow always has local dance groups going along with him to show, this is the propaganda. Oh, we have this glorious past. Oh, it's great. I can't imagine that Parren was particularly happy about this. She's at the end of her life. She's very ill. But Metaxas's ideals included this idea of men and women having separate roles, but that women should not be that much in public. It may have been disheartening if she looked at what she had created being utilized to promote an ideology that in some ways took her decades back to where she began. I don't want to leave her on such a sad note, though, because I really do think that she couldn't have done everything she did. She couldn't have fought as hard as she did and completed all the amazing projects that she did without having this idea of hope for the future in her. In 1936, let me get it here. In 1936, Parren attends a conference at the Parnassos Literary Society in her honor, honoring her work not just with the Lykeion, but also with the Feminist and other advocacy groups. It's a little ironic because the Parnassos Literary Society was yet another place that women were not allowed to go to when Parren was coming up in Athens. And in fact, she negotiated with them. She was the one who negotiated with the Parnassos Literary Society to allow women to attend some lectures as long as they paid a certain fee. But in her speech that she gives to them, the Greek is written on the screen. I just want to illustrate sort of what I take away from this. She says that she doesn't think about herself. She's not worried about what's going on for herself. Rather, she's looking forward with hope to the future and to the young women of tomorrow. And not just the young women, but to these new, complete women that she sees on the horizon. This is in 1936. In 1938, Parren was made the honorary president for life of the Lykeion Ellinidon. And at that point, due to her growing health concerns, she does step by, and the vice president, Anna Triantafylidou, takes over acting duties in her place. Kalliroi Siganou-Parren dies in Athens in 1940, possibly of a stroke. She's buried in the first cemetery of Athens, and the first woman to be buried there at the expense of the Greek government. Now, I know that Christina loves Palamas's poem, so I wanted to bring it here. So Christina and I, when we first touched base about Parren, she immediately brought up this poem. This is a poem that Kostis Palamas wrote for Parren, about Parren, praising her and her efforts, not just to liberate herself, but also to liberate everyone around her. One of the things I'd like to point out is if you look at the very beginning, he compares her with Athena, Maria, Eleni, and Evia.
Yeah.
This is a list of biblical figures, women, and goddesses. He is using Parren's own conception of female history in order to describe her. He is honoring her not just in his words, but in utilizing her own techniques in how to convey honor to women. Kalliroi Siganou-Parren is, in my opinion, very much a woman of her time, but an extraordinary woman of her time. She was able to actively participate in a society that repeatedly told her that she was made to be subordinate and less than her compatriots simply because of her gender. She was born into a world where her country was a very, very small kingdom that was struggling to exist. And even though she wasn't the person who could go out on the battlefield and fight, she found other ways to fight for Greece and work towards the modern Greek state. But most importantly to me, she's a woman who never stops giving up hope, never stops hoping. She never stops fighting. If there's a project, she's on it. If there's someone to reach out to, she's writing a letter. When I spoke about how in the 1920s, her political activity began to decline. That's correct. But she was also on the forefront in organizing the refugee aid for the refugees coming from Thrace and Micracia after 1922. And not only that, she was reaching out to English women and French women at the time, leaders of their own international feminist organizations, demanding to know what they were doing to try and help the refugees who were being slaughtered, her countrymen who were being slaughtered. This is not a woman who would ever have given up. This is not a woman who could ever have been beaten. And I am more than happy to continue talking about her and to continue researching about her, but we are at 12:15 right now. So I think I'm going to end the talk there. Thank you all very much for listening to me talk about a woman that I find absolutely fascinating. I hope I've said one or two things that have interested you or made your day. I'm more than happy to stay here and answer questions or talk. But for now, thank you, Perry. Thank you, Christina. I appreciate everything that you did. And thank you, Hawk, for setting this up. And I know that, I think I saw that she was in here, but I'd also like to do a special shout out to Ms. Irene Savas, who is the president of the Boston Lykeion Ellinidon, and who is the person who introduced me to this remarkable individual, Kalliroi Siganou-Parren, and the amazing work of the Lykeion. So thank you all very much, and I hope that you have a lovely weekend.
Thank you, Claire, so much. This was so informative. I couldn't take notes fast enough. And I see your passion, and it's, I think, coinciding with my passion for knowledge as well as for supporting the Greek women. So at this time, if anyone has any questions, you can turn on your videos and you can, I'm going to stop the recording.